The morning of June 11, 1943. Southeast of Iceland. The North Atlantic stretched grey and cold beneath a ceiling of clouds that hung low enough to touch. Wing Commander Ronald Thompson sat in the left seat of Fortress Mk2 FA-704, a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress painted white for maritime patrol, its American-built frame now serving the RAF's 206 Squadron. The bomber's four Wright Cyclone engines droned in steady rhythm, their 1,700 horsepower each carrying the aircraft through air so thick with moisture it left streaks on the plexiglass nose. At 11:10 in the morning, the lookouts spotted it. A dark shape on the surface, 6 miles ahead. A submarine. U-417, a Type VIC U-boat, running on the surface to recharge its batteries. The Germans had learned to respect aircraft like Thompson's, had armed their submarines with 20mm anti-aircraft guns and trained their crews to fight back. But Thompson didn't hesitate. He pushed the control yoke forward, and the Flying Fortress, this four-engine heavy bomber designed to drop high explosives on German cities from 30,000 feet, dove toward the water to hunt a submarine. If someone had told you that would be worth watching, subscribe for more war stories rooted in fact, not fiction. Also, hit the notification bell so YouTube alerts you whenever I upload. What followed in the next 5 minutes would prove what many in the U-boat service were beginning to suspect that June. That the hunter had become the hunted. That the vast Atlantic, which had been their killing ground for 4 years, had turned against them. And that even sinking your enemy might not save you. Thompson was attacking a submarine the way you'd attack a freight train. With a bomber. The irony would have been absurd if it weren't so deadly serious. The B-17 Flying Fortress had been designed in 1935 by Boeing to meet a U.S. Army Air Corps specification for a strategic bomber. The idea was simple. Build an aircraft that could fly higher and farther than enemy fighters could reach, carry enough bombs to destroy industrial targets, and defend itself with so many machine guns that attacking it would be suicide. The name came from a journalist who'd seen the prototype bristling with gun positions and called it a flying fortress. Boeing loved the name. So did the Army. By 1941, when the RAF took delivery of its first batch of 20 B-17CS, designated Fortress Mki, the aircraft had already earned a reputation. Unfortunately, it was the wrong reputation. The RAF tried using the Fortress as a daylight bomber over Europe. The results were disastrous. The aircraft flew too high for accuracy. The Norden bombsight that the Americans prized so highly proved nearly useless in European weather, and despite all those defensive guns, German fighters tore the formations apart. By September 1941, after losing 8 aircraft in combat and suffering countless mechanical failures, RAF Bomber Command gave up. The Fortress, they concluded, was unsuitable for bombing Germany. But the RAF didn't scrap the aircraft. They did what military organizations often do with equipment that doesn't work as advertised. They gave it to someone else. In this case, to Coastal Command, the branch of the RAF responsible for protecting shipping and hunting submarines. The logic was sound, even if it was partly born of desperation. Coastal Command needed aircraft with long range and endurance. The B-17 had both. It could fly for hours over the Atlantic, far beyond the reach of land-based fighters, searching for the U-boats that were bleeding Britain to death. So the fortresses that had failed over Germany were repainted white, fitted with ASV, air-to-surface vessel, radar in place of some gun turrets, and sent to the most desolate airbases Britain could offer. Places like Benbecula in the Outer Hebrides. Places where the wind never stopped and the rain came in sideways. Places where the nearest tree was 100 miles away and the nearest German U-boat might be just over the horizon. By August 1942, Coastal Command had been reinforced with 45 Fortress Mkia aircraft, the RAF designation for the American B-17E, and 19 Fortress Mk2 aircraft, which were B-17FS. These were better aircraft than the Mki. More reliable engines. Better defensive armament. And crews who understood that their mission wasn't to bomb cities from high altitude but to find submarines on the surface and kill them before they could dive. The weapon they carried was the depth charge. Not bombs. Depth charges. Cylindrical containers filled with torpex, an explosive 50% more powerful than TNT, set to detonate at a specific depth beneath the water's surface. The Mk-7 depth charge weighed 250 pounds. A fortress on anti-submarine patrol typically carried 6 to 8 of them, loaded into racks in the bomb bay. The challenge was getting them close enough to matter. A U-boat's pressure hull could withstand tremendous force. Tests and combat experience had proven that a depth charge needed to explode within 15 to 20 feet of the submarine's hull to rupture it. Anything farther, and you might shake the crew, knock out some equipment, crack a pipe or two, but the boat would survive. Many U-boats survived hundreds of depth charge attacks over many hours. U-427 survived 678 depth charges in April 1945. But aircraft had one advantage that surface ships didn't. Surprise. A destroyer making a depth charge run had to steam directly over the U-boat's last known position, which gave a skilled commander time to dive deep and maneuver. An aircraft diving out of the clouds at 200 miles per hour gave the U-boat seconds, maybe less. If the submarine was caught on the surface, if the aircraft's attack was accurate, the result could be decisive. By February 1943, RAF Coastal Command's fortresses were proving their worth. On the 3rd of February, 220 Squadron Fortress MKIIA FL-456, flown by Pilot Officer Ramsden, caught U-265 on the surface 4 miles from convoy HX-224. Ramsden positioned his aircraft with the sun behind it, dove from 50 feet, and dropped 7 depth charges. The submarine shattered. 4 to 6 men went down with it. 4 days later, the same squadron's Fortress FL-459, this time with Pilot Officer Robertson at the controls, surprised U-624 southeast of Greenland. The depth charges found their mark. Another submarine, another 4 to 6 German sailors, lost to the Atlantic. This was the new reality of the Battle of the Atlantic in 1943. For 4 years, from September 1939 until the spring of 1943, the U-boats had dominated. They'd operated with near impunity in what submariners called the happy time. First in 1940, after France fell and gave them bases on the Atlantic coast. Then again in early 1942, when America entered the war but failed to implement convoy systems along its eastern seaboard. U-boats had torpedoed merchant ships within sight of cities like New York and Miami, often with the ships silhouetted against coastal lights that nobody thought to black out. But by May 1943, everything had changed. The month that would become known as Black May in the German U-boat service. 41 U-boats sunk. 25% of the operational force, gone in 31 days. The losses were catastrophic, unsustainable. On May 24, Grand Admiral Karl Donitz, who commanded the U-boat arm and had recently become Commander-in-Chief of the entire Kriegsmarine, made the decision that effectively ended the Battle of the Atlantic. He withdrew most of his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. The reasons for this defeat were many and they all came together at once. The Allies had finally closed the Atlantic air gap, the area in mid-ocean beyond the range of land-based aircraft, where U-boats had operated freely. Very long-range Liberators, B-24s modified with extra fuel tanks, now patrolled areas that had been safe havens. Escort carriers, small aircraft carriers converted from merchant ship hulls, traveled with convoys and provided air cover where none had existed before. Centimetric radar, operating on shorter wavelengths than the Germans could detect, allowed aircraft and ships to find surfaced U-boats in darkness and bad weather. High-frequency direction finding equipment, called Huff-Duff by the crews who used it, let convoy escorts pinpoint U-boats from their radio transmissions without breaking the codes. Improved depth charges, using Torpex instead of TNT and more aerodynamic casings that sank faster. Better tactics, with dedicated support groups of destroyers and corvettes that could hunt U-boats aggressively instead of just defending convoys. And Enigma. The breaking of German naval codes at Bletchley Park, which gave the Allies advance warning of U-boat positions and allowed convoys to be routed around them. But perhaps most important was sheer production. American shipyards launched over 11 million tons of merchant shipping in 1943 alone. Liberty ships, those ugly, welded cargo vessels that could be built in as little as 42 days, were sliding down the ways faster than U-boats could sink them. The Atlantic had become a numbers game, and the Allies were winning. For the men in the U-boats, this meant dying. Not sometimes. Not occasionally. Regularly, predictably, with mathematical certainty. At the start of the war, a U-boat commander could expect to complete 6 combat patrols before being killed or captured. By mid-1943, the average was less than 2. Of the roughly 40,000 men who served in the German U-boat service during the war, 30,000 would die. 75%. No military arm in any nation in World War II suffered comparable losses. Wing Commander Thompson knew these statistics, at least in general form. He'd been hunting U-boats since 206 Squadron converted to fortresses in autumn 1942. He'd completed successful attacks before, had been awarded the Distinguished Service Order for his skill and leadership. In late March 1943, he'd attacked a U-boat and straddled it with depth charges. 3 days later, he'd done it again, pressing home his attack despite heavy anti-aircraft fire from the submarine. In April, he'd attacked 2 submarines in one night, sinking one with depth charges and raking another with machine gun fire. Now, on June 11th, flying FA 704 southeast of Iceland, he'd found another. U-417, under the command of Oberleutnant Sir C. Wolfgang Schreiner, was on its first patrol. The boat had been commissioned in September 1942, spent months working up in the Baltic, training its crew of 46 men. Type VIIC submarines like U-417 were the backbone of the U-boat fleet. 769 tons surfaced, 871 submerged. 220 feet long, 20 feet wide. Armed with 5 torpedo tubes, for forward and 1 aft, carrying 14 torpedoes. 1 88mm deck gun. 2 20mm anti-aircraft guns. Those anti-aircraft guns were the reason many U-boats still tried to fight on the surface when aircraft attacked. In March 1943, U-333 had stayed surfaced when attacked by a British aircraft and shot it down. Donitz had hoped this could become standard practice, that better anti-aircraft armament would let U-boats fight their way through air patrols. Several boats were being converted to flak U-boats, with additional guns and armor specifically to engage aircraft. It didn't work. The problem was time. A submarine caught on the surface by an aircraft faced a choice: dive immediately and hope to get deep enough to evade the depth charges, or stay up and fight. Diving meant safety, assuming you had enough warning. The Type VIIC could fully submerge in 30 seconds under ideal conditions. But those 30 seconds were often the difference between life and death. Stay surface to fight, and you gave the aircraft time to line up its attack, to adjust its approach, to drop its weapons with precision. And aircraft were fast. A B-17 cruising at 180 miles per hour could cover a mile in 20 seconds. Thompson's fortress was already damaged before it reached U-417. The submarine's gunners were good. 20mm cannon shells tore into the bomber's nose, the cockpit, the wings, the bomb bay, the rear turret. Metal fragments sprayed through the fuselage. But Thompson held his course. 4 engines, 13,000 pounds empty, 65,000 pounds fully loaded. This massive aircraft designed to fight its way through German fighter defenses over Berlin, dove toward a submarine on the surface of the North Atlantic. 50 feet above the water, Thompson released his depth charges. 6 of them, spaced precisely to create a pattern that would bracket the submarine. The fortress roared overhead, its gunners raking U-417's deck with machine gun fire as it passed. The depth charges hit the water. Their aerodynamic casings allowed them to penetrate quickly, sinking at a rate of roughly 16 feet per second. They'd been set to detonate at 25 feet deep. Within 2 seconds of hitting the water, they exploded. The physics of a depth charge detonation are brutal. The torpex inside undergoes chemical reaction at roughly 26,000 feet per second. The solid explosive becomes gas, but at such high pressure that it momentarily occupies a fraction of the original volume. This pressure creates a shock wave that expands outward through the water at the speed of sound. Water doesn't compress easily, which means the energy of the explosion propagates efficiently, maintaining lethal force over considerable distance. But it's not just the initial shock that kills. The expanding gas bubble from the explosion rises toward the surface, creating turbulence, and then collapses, creating another pressure wave. If the submarine is close enough, these pressure waves can buckle the hull, rupture welds, crack pipes, or simply lift the entire boat out of the water and drop it back down, breaking its spine. Thompson's pattern was good. The crews of U-417, which had yet to sink or even damage a single Allied ship in its first and only patrol, had seconds to react. The submarine was already listing. Water was coming in. 4 to 6 men, most of them in their early 20s, tried to save the boat, tried to reach the surface, tried to survive. Several survivors from U-417 were seen in the water after the boat went down. None would be rescued. The North Atlantic in June was cold enough to kill an unprotected swimmer in minutes. Even with life vests, even with survival suits, hypothermia was quick and certain. Thompson had bigger problems. FA-704 had taken serious damage from U-417's anti-aircraft fire. Both inboard engines, numbers 2 and 3, were failing. The electrical systems were damaged. The aircraft was losing altitude. Thompson radioed his position and the results of his attack. Then, roughly 15 minutes after sinking the U-boat, he made the decision to ditch. A B-17 ditching in the North Atlantic was a controlled crash at best, catastrophe at worst. The aircraft wasn't designed for water landings. The bombardier's position in the nose, that distinctive plexiglass bubble that gave B-17s their bug-eyed appearance, would shatter on impact and flood instantly. The bomb bay doors, if not perfectly sealed, would let in tons of water in seconds. The weight of the engines would drag the wings down. If you were lucky, if the pilot was skilled, if the sea state wasn't too rough, you might have 2 minutes before the aircraft sank. Maybe 3. Thompson was skilled. All 8 crew members survived the ditching and managed to get into their emergency dinghy. One small rubber raft in the middle of the North Atlantic, roughly 600 miles from the nearest land. They had no supplies, no water, no food. The survival gear that should have been in the dinghy had either been lost in the ditching or hadn't been properly stored to begin with. 8 men, wet, cold, adrift in water that was 45 degrees Fahrenheit, with weather that could turn deadly with no warning. Thompson's radio call had given their position, but rescue in the North Atlantic was never guaranteed. The ocean is vast. Weather limited visibility. Rescue aircraft had limited range and limited time to search. Ships could be 100 miles away or more, moving with convoys that couldn't afford to slow down or divert course, not with U-boats still prowling, still dangerous despite the losses they'd suffered. The crew of FA-704 spent 3 days in that dinghy. 72 hours. The North Atlantic in June meant daylight for most of the day, but also rain, wind, waves that could capsize a small raft without warning. Hypothermia was the immediate threat, but dehydration followed close behind. You can't drink seawater. Your kidneys can't process the salt concentration. Drinking it accelerates dehydration and leads to kidney failure. Men stranded at sea sometimes went mad from thirst, surrounded by water they couldn't drink. On June 14, 3 days after Thompson sank U-417, an American Navy PBY Catalina flying boat from Patrol Squadron VP-84 spotted the dinghy. The pilot, Lieutenant Douglas Vieira of the U.S. Naval Reserve, attempted to land and pick up the British aircrew. The Catalina touched down on the water, and something went wrong. The aircraft crashed. 9 American sailors found themselves in the water, scrambling into 2 life rafts, now themselves in need of rescue. The attempt to save 8 RAF crew members had instead created 17 people adrift in the North Atlantic. But Thompson's crew had been spotted. Other aircraft were searching. Later that same day, a British Catalina from 190 Squadron RAF, piloted by squadron leader Jack Holmes, arrived on scene. Holmes managed what Vieira had not: a successful landing in rough Atlantic seas. He took Thompson's crew aboard, all 8 of them, and flew them to safety. The American Catalina crew would wait longer. Their rescue took more time to coordinate, more searching, more aircraft. But they too survived. Squadron leader Holmes would be awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for the rescue. The citation would note his skill in landing the Catalina in difficult conditions and his determination to save the downed aircrew. Thompson would receive another decoration as well, this time the Distinguished Flying Cross to go with his DSO. The citation noted that in June 1943, during an anti-submarine patrol, He had sighted a large submarine and promptly attacked. In the face of withering fire from the vessel, which took violent evading action, Thompson had executed a devastating attack. The U-boat was extensively damaged and, as it sank, many of its crew were left in the water. Thompson's aircraft had been repeatedly hit and, soon after the engagement had terminated, he was forced to bring it down onto the sea. The citation was clinical. Factual. It didn't capture what it felt like to dive a 4-engine bomber at a submarine shooting back with a 20mm cannon. It didn't describe the moment when you knew both engines were gone and the ocean was coming up fast. It didn't mention the 3 days in a rubber raft wondering if anyone would find you before the cold finished what the Germans had started. But it recorded the essential truth. Thompson had found the enemy, attacked despite the danger, sunk the submarine, and brought his crew home alive. U-417 never sank a ship. Its entire operational career consisted of one patrol that ended on June 11, 1943, southeast of Iceland, at the hands of a bomber that was never supposed to fight submarines in the first place. There is a moment, preserved in the official 206 Squadron historical manuscript compiled shortly after the war, where the story of Thompson and FA-704 expands outward from two machines fighting above the North Atlantic into something much larger. The Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches sent a message to the squadron after the Admiralty confirmed U-417 as a known sinking. The message read, "Please convey to Wing Commander Thompson and the surviving crew of our /206 my warmest congratulations on their success on the 11th of June. I greatly admired the gallant manner in which the attack was pressed home." That phrase, the gallant manner in which the attack was pressed home. It is the language of official commendation, clipped and formal, British in the way that British official communications are always British, understated to the point of invisibility. What it meant, stripped of its formal garb, was this. A man flew a 4-engine heavy bomber into cannon fire at wavetop height, dropped his weapons with sufficient precision to destroy a submarine, lost 2 of his engines to the return fire, ditched in the North Atlantic, and sat in a rubber raft for 3 days before rescue. And he did all of that willingly. In the third summer of a war that had already consumed millions of lives, that was simply Tuesday. If you've made it this far, consider subscribing. There are dozens more stories like this one, drawn from the records and the men who left them, waiting for you on this channel. But to understand why Thompson flew that attack the way he did, without hesitation, without diversion, directly into the muzzles of U-417's anti-aircraft guns, you have to understand what June 1943 meant to the people who were living through it. Not what it means to us, looking back from a distance of more than 80 years, with the outcome already known. What it meant to them, in the moment, when the outcome was not known at all. The men who flew maritime patrol from Benbecula in the summer of 1943 knew they were part of something that had turned. They could feel it the way you feel a wind shift before a storm breaks. The losses that had defined the previous 2 years of convoy warfare. The convoys where you arrived to find oil slicks and floating wreckage and men in the water who had been there long enough that rescue was already impossible. Those losses were diminishing. The U-boats that had seemed everywhere in 1942, that had sunk ships within sight of the American coastline with impunity, had been dealt a blow in May that the air crews understood was significant even if they didn't know the precise numbers. Those numbers were these. In the 31 days of May 1943, 41 operational U-boats were destroyed. Some histories put the number at 43 when accounting for losses in all theaters and from all causes. Either figure represented roughly a quarter of the entire operational U-boat force, gone in a single month. 1,832 men of the U-boat service died in May of that year. 183 survived the sinking of their boats. The ratio of dead to survivors was 10-1. Donitz knew the numbers better than anyone. His operations staff tracked them daily, carefully, updating tables that grew grimmer with each passing week. He had also received news that cut deeper than any operational statistic. On the 24th of May, U-954 had been sunk south of Greenland during attacks on convoy SC-130, a convoy that, in a bitter irony, no Allied ship was lost to during the same engagement. Among the men who died aboard U-954 was Lieutenant Sir C. Peter Donitz, the Admiral's son, 21 years old, on his first patrol. Grand Admiral Donitz wrote in his memoirs, published after the war as 10 years and 20 days, that he reported the loss of his son to his wife without revealing the circumstances. He wrote simply that Peter had fallen in the course of his duties. What else could a father say? Who had built the service that sent his son to die in it? What accountability, what grief, could survive the arithmetic of that position? The next day, May 24th, Donitz transmitted orders withdrawing the main body of U-boats from the North Atlantic convoy routes. He phrased it in operational terms, as commanders do. The boats were to be repositioned. New tactics were being developed. Improvements to equipment were forthcoming. The snorkel device, which would allow submarines to run their diesel engines while submerged, was being accelerated in development. New acoustic torpedoes, homing on the propeller sounds of convoy escorts, were being readied for deployment. Patience was required. What he did not write in the war diary, what he did not say over the encrypted radio channels that Bletchley Park was already reading with increasing regularity, was the thing that every commander in every war eventually confronts. That the strategy he had built his career and his service upon had failed, that the fundamental premise of the U-boat campaign, that submarines could strangle Britain's Atlantic lifeline faster than American industry could replace the losses, had been invalidated by events. The events were not mysterious. They were not matters of superior German heroism being defeated by Allied trickery. They were the cumulative result of industrial capacity, scientific ingenuity, tactical learning, and the sheer organizational effort of three industrial democracies applying their full weight to a military problem. American shipyards in 1943 launched ships faster than any nation had ever launched them before. Thousands of workers, many of them women who had never held a welding torch before Pearl Harbor, built Liberty ships to prefabricated designs, welding rather than riveting, standardizing every component so that parts could be shipped across the continent and assembled at the water's edge. A Liberty ship that had taken 230 days to build in 1941 took less than 50 days by 1943. One was built in 4 days and 15.5 hours as a demonstration of what was theoretically possible. Against that output, the U-boats could not win. Donitz had needed his submarines to sink 700,000 tons of Allied shipping per month to starve Britain into negotiation. He had achieved that figure only twice. Once in June 1942, once in November of the same year. The Americans were launching more than that in new construction every month of 1943. The arithmetic was irreversible. But none of this meant the war at sea was over. Donitz did not intend to quit. He intended to find new hunting grounds, develop new technology, keep pressure on the Allies and force them to maintain their enormous anti-submarine effort rather than redirecting those resources to other theaters. U-boats would return to the convoy routes in the autumn of 1943 with new weapons. They did, and they suffered further catastrophic losses and achieved almost nothing. For the crews of 206 Squadron, the summer and autumn of 1943 meant continuing to fly. The patrols did not stop because Black May had happened. The Atlantic did not become safe because Donitz had temporarily withdrawn his main forces. Isolated U-boats still operated, still hunted, still occasionally found and torpedoed merchant ships. The aircrews at Benbecula still took off in all weathers, still navigated thousands of miles of featureless ocean, still peered through rain-streaked plexiglass for the shape of a submarine on the surface. The physical reality of those patrols deserves a moment's reflection, because it is easy to read histories of the Battle of the Atlantic and remain at the level of statistics and strategy, to see the tonnage figures and the loss rates and miss entirely what it actually meant to live them. A maritime patrol in a coastal command fortress MKRIA from Benbecula in the summer of 1943 meant waking before first light in a stone building on an island in the Outer Hebrides where the wind blew in from the Atlantic with a persistence that felt personal. It meant eating whatever the RAF was providing that morning, usually something acceptable but rarely memorable, and pulling on flying gear that was marginally adequate against the cold you would encounter at altitude and entirely inadequate against the cold you would encounter if you ended up in the water. It meant walking out to an aircraft that had been serviced, fueled, and armed by ground crew who worked in conditions that aircrew were at least spared, outside, in the Scottish weather, for hours at a time, with tools that were often inadequate and parts that were often scarce. The fortress required constant maintenance. Its 4 Wright Cyclone engines each had 18 cylinders and produced nearly 1,700 horsepower, and the complex interaction of oil, fuel, ignition timing, and supercharger pressure that made them work reliably was the result of continuous attention rather than inherent mechanical virtue. The patrol itself could last anywhere from 8 to 12 hours. Sometimes longer. The aircraft climbed to patrol altitude, established its search pattern over the assigned area, and flew. The crew rotated through their stations. Those who could sleep tried to sleep. Those who couldn't stared at the ocean below. The ocean gave nothing back. It was gray or it was darker gray. It moved in swells that could be 20 feet from trough to crest or 40 feet in a North Atlantic storm. It absorbed light and people and ships with equal indifference. The radar operators, using the ASV Mark III equipment that had proven so devastating to U-boats operating at night or in poor visibility, watched their cathode ray tubes for the echo that indicated a metal object on the surface. The visual lookouts, posted at the waist gun positions and the nose, scanned the surface with binoculars. The hours accumulated. Usually, there was nothing. Not every patrol found a submarine. Not every sighting led to an attack. Not every attack succeeded. That was the nature of the campaign. A vast, exhausting, routine effort punctuated by moments of violent contact. When contact came, it came fast. The mathematics of a 4-engine aircraft traveling at 180 miles per hour closing on a submarine that needed 30 seconds to fully submerge meant that the time available for decision-making was compressed to nothing useful. The pilot had to begin his attack run as soon as the submarine was sighted, before the U-boat's lookouts had necessarily spotted the aircraft, before the submarine had begun evasive action, because every second of delay was seconds the U-boat crew were using to get below the surface. Below the surface, the depth charges were far less likely to find the boat. This is why the fight-back order issued by Donitz in the spring of 1943 represented such a significant tactical shift. Rather than immediately diving when aircraft were sighted, U-boat commanders were instructed to stay on the surface and engage attacking aircraft with anti-aircraft fire, making the aircraft fight for its attack approach, throwing off the pilot's aim, and potentially shooting it down. The theory was sound. The practice proved fatal to the submarines that tried it. Because what Donitz had underestimated, or had chosen not to fully weigh, was the quality of the men flying those aircraft. Thompson, descending toward U-417 while 20mm shells tore through FA-704's fuselage, was not making a cold calculation about acceptable risk. He was a professional who had trained for this, who had done it before, who understood that in the seconds available to him, hesitation was more dangerous than aggression. Pulling away from the attack, circling to approach from a safer angle, meant giving U-417's crew the time they needed to get below the waves. Pressing home the attack meant that even if you were hit, even if you were going to crash, you had the chance to put your weapons on target before the aircraft went down. That calculus, the willingness to press home an attack on a target that was shooting back with every gun it had, was not unique to Thompson. It was a professional quality that 206 Squadron had developed collectively, through example, through selection, through the gradual weeding out over time of those who lacked it and the retention of those who had it. The citation for Thompson's DSO, awarded earlier in 1943, noted that he had attacked 2 submarines in one night in April, pressing home his assault on the second despite heavy anti-aircraft fire. The Distinguished Flying Cross that followed the June attack used similar language. Pressed home. The phrase recurs because the institutional memory of Coastal Command recognized this quality as the difference between an attack that succeeded and one that didn't. What the rescue operation that followed Thompson's ditching reveals about the campaign is something different, and something equally important. 17 people ended up in the North Atlantic because one crew sank a submarine and another crew tried to save them. The cascading consequence of a single 10-minute engagement stretched over 6 days and involved aircraft from at least 4 different squadrons, including RAF Coastal Command units, the United States Navy, and Norwegian and British flying boat crews. The coordination required to keep searching, to find the right spot in 600 miles of open ocean, to attempt rescues in sea states that made landing a flying boat an act of calculated risk, represented a support infrastructure as formidable in its own way as the attack capability of the fortresses themselves. The Catalina crew from American Navy Patrol Squadron VP-84, whose aircraft crashed trying to land and collect Thompson's men, faced the same arithmetic Thompson had faced over U-417. Attempting to land a large flying boat in rough North Atlantic seas was dangerous. Not attempting it meant leaving 8 RAF airmen to die of exposure. The pilot, Lieutenant Douglas Vieira, chose to attempt the landing. His aircraft didn't survive the attempt. The situation became worse before it became better. What saved everyone who could be saved was the persistence of the search, the willingness of additional crews to keep flying, to keep looking, to keep trying. Squadron leader Holmes in his British Catalina, landing successfully where Vieira had not, getting Thompson's crew aboard and flying them out. The American destroyer that later found the surviving members of Vieira's crew, threaded cautiously through a minefield to reach the dinghy, guided by circling aircraft. Of the 9 Americans from the crashed Catalina, the records indicate that ultimately most survived, though the rescue took considerably longer and extracted a severe toll from the exposure. One detail from the squadron historical manuscript deserves particular attention. It notes that the ditching of FA-704 and the subsequent events prompted 206 Squadron to formally request improved forward-firing armament for their fortresses. The aircraft carried only a single 300 caliber Browning machine gun in the nose position, a weapon of modest stopping power against a surfaced submarine's crew and deck guns. The squadron wanted 50 caliber forward guns, which would have given attacking pilots the ability to suppress the U-boat's anti-aircraft positions more effectively during the attack run. The request went through channels. Negotiations were still in progress when the squadron converted to Liberators in March 1944. This small, bureaucratic detail illuminates something essential about the nature of the campaign, and perhaps about the nature of all prolonged military conflicts. The men at the operational level, the people who were flying the patrols and pressing home the attacks and ending up in the water, saw clearly what needed to be done and asked for the tools to do it better. The system that supplied and equipped them moved at its own pace, governed by competing priorities, limited resources, procurement cycles, and the enormous inertia of institutions under stress. By the time the question was resolved, the aircraft that needed the guns had been replaced by a different aircraft with a different set of capabilities and a different set of needs. Thompson himself survived the war. He continued in the RAF after the conflict ended, receiving a permanent commission in the rank of squadron leader and advancing further in the post-war service. His decorations, the DSO and the DFC, marked him as a man of particular courage and effectiveness. The commendation from the Commander-in-Chief Western Approaches, warmly congratulating him and his surviving crew on their success, was recorded in the squadron's official history and preserved there for anyone who cared to look. U-417 left no such legacy. Commissioned in September 1942, based in Kiel for working up, dispatched on its first operational patrol, sunk on June 11, 1943. The submarine's entire contribution to the German war effort consisted of a transit through North Atlantic waters it never had the opportunity to exploit, followed by a surface engagement with an aircraft it damaged but could not stop. Its crew of 4 to 6 men, their average age somewhere in the early 20s according to the demographics that characterized the U-boat service by mid-war, went down with the boat or into water they could not survive. There is a German naval memorial at Lebo, near Kiel, on the Baltic coast, where the U-boat service is commemorated. The names of those who died are recorded there. Among them, presumably, are the names of the men aboard U-417. Their families received the standard notification, fallen in service of the fatherland. The ocean kept no record of the manner of their dying. The legacy of June 11, 1943, southeast of Iceland, is not contained in the names or the decorations or the confirmatory messages from fleet commanders. It is contained in a fact that requires no embellishment. In the summer of 1943, a heavy bomber designed to fight above 30,000 feet was being used to hunt submarines at 50 feet above the waves. It worked. The bomber won. The submarine that had been designed specifically to operate in that ocean, that had been armed with guns specifically to fight aircraft that attacked it, sank anyway. And the crew that sank it, having accomplished what they were sent to do, ditched their dying aircraft into the sea and floated in a rubber raft for 3 days waiting for rescue that, eventually, came. If you take nothing else from this story, take the image of those 8 men in that raft, in the North Atlantic in June of 1943. They had just killed 4 to 6 people. They had nearly killed themselves doing it. The ocean around them was the same ocean that had been a graveyard for so many ships and crews over the previous 4 years. But something had changed in that ocean, something fundamental, something that the statistics of Black May had announced and the events of June 11 confirmed at the granular level of 1 aircraft and 1 submarine. the hunters had changed places. Donitz, writing after the war, was frank about the moment of recognition. He admitted that the Allies had defeated his submarines through a combination of radar, aircraft, and convoy organization that his boats could not overcome. He said that the airplane could no longer be dismissed as a secondary threat. He had once, in the overconfident language of a commander who had not yet confronted the full weight of what was coming, compared the airplane's ability to harm a U-boat to a crow's ability to fight a mole. The mole was supposed to go underground, to be safe in its element. But by the summer of 1943, the sky had reached the mole. The crow had learned to wait until the mole surfaced to recharge its batteries, and then it had descended at 180 miles per hour with 6 depth charges and a wing commander who had decided, somewhere in the seconds of that attack run, that he was going to put those weapons on that submarine regardless of what the submarine's guns did to his aircraft. The B-17 Flying Fortress, rejected by Bomber Command as unsuitable for its intended purpose, had found its purpose on the Atlantic. Repainted white, stripped of some of its defensive turrets, fitted with radar instead, dispatched to the most remote airfields in the British Isles to fly the least glamorous patrols of any aircrew in any theater of the war. No crowds cheering them off. No propaganda films celebrating their missions. No cities below them with the drama and horror of burning factories and exploding oil depots to give their work the visual language of warfare as it was understood by people who read newspapers and watched newsreel footage. Just the ocean. Hours of it. And occasionally, if you were both skilled enough and fortunate enough, a shape on the surface that your training and your aircraft and your weapons allowed you to address, briefly and violently, before the war moved on. The ship that died that June morning off Iceland never threatened Allied shipping again. Neither did the 30,000 other men of the German U-boat service who went down in their boats over 6 years of a campaign that had been, in the end, a numbers war, and the numbers had never really been on their side. What had been on their side, in the early years, was time and opportunity, the time before the Allies organized their convoys properly, before the air gap was closed, before the radar reached centimetric wavelengths, before the American shipyards reached their full capacity. By June 1943, time had run out. The opportunity was gone. What remained was the killing, which would continue until the very last days of the war in Europe, and the dying, which continued alongside it. Thompson flew again after the rescue. His crew flew again. 206 Squadron flew again. The patrols continued from Benbecula until October 1943, when the squadron moved to the Azores for operations over the southern Atlantic. They flew fortresses until March 1944, then converted to liberators. By the end of the war, they had confirmed 9 U-boat sinkings. A squadron of fewer than 200 men, flying aircraft that were never supposed to be anti-submarine platforms, had sent 9 submarines and somewhere approaching 400 men to the bottom of the Atlantic. The ocean remembers none of it. It rolls on as it rolled in September 1939 when the first U-boat of the campaign torpedoed the SS Athenia within hours of Britain's declaration of war. It is indifferent to the DFCS and the DSOS and the commendatory messages from commanders-in-chief. It is indifferent to the 4 to 6 men of U-417 and the 8 men of FA-704 and the 9 Americans of the crashed Catalina. What happened to them happened in a place where there were no witnesses but the aircraft circling overhead, the instruments reading altitude and airspeed, and the cold water below that kept the depth charges cool as they sank toward the depth set on their fuses. But we can be witnesses, at this distance. We can read the squadron history and the Admiralty assessments and the DFC citations and understand what they record. A man flew a bomber into a fight it wasn't designed for, against a target that was shooting back, and he didn't miss. That is the whole story. Everything else, the historical context and the casualty figures and the industrial comparisons, is the frame. The picture is Thompson diving FA-704 toward U-417 on the 11th of June, 1943, holding his course through the 20mm fire, releasing his depth charges at 50 feet, and beginning the long, badly damaged turn back toward Benbecula he would never complete. He didn't complete it because the aircraft was too badly damaged. He completed the mission instead. In the mathematics of that war, in that ocean, at that moment, those were not the same thing. And the difference between them is the whole story of what it meant to fight the Battle of the Atlantic from the air, above a sea that gave nothing and forgave nothing, in a bomber that nobody wanted until the moment it was exactly what was needed. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it. These accounts survive because people like you keep them alive.